There are people who come into our lives whose very presence changes us forever. And one such person in my life was Andreas Hinz, who was born in Germany in 1965. Andy's mother was Jewish, but due to the fact that no formal proof of her status could be found, he went through a formal conversion with the European Bet Din in 1997. Andy earned a degree in literature, theology and linguistics at the University of Wuppertal, before becoming a research assistant at the universities of Wuppertal and Osnabrück, before then completing a master's in literature and theology, achieving top grades. He was a truly extraordinary intellect, and I think he was fluent in 4 different languages, including ancient Greek. He started getting involved in the Jewish community in 1984, particularly in publishing. He realized that the rabbinate was for him and started to prepare for a profound change in life direction. At the time, the Geiger College in Germany needed a poster boy, and the pressure on him to study there was immense. He resisted. One prominent individual in the community even threatened to out him if he didn't study there. And Andy's response to that deeply disturbing threat was very simple. That if that rabbi outed him, then he would out them in return. He stood up for himself. So his choice to study at the Liobet College was not a simple one. It showed real commitment. As the mark of the kind of young man he was, once he decided to close his publishing company after running it for 10 years, he made sure that every one of his employees first had a job. The idea of making someone else redundant so that he could become a rabbi was impossible to him. So he waited an entire year to close down the company and find all of his employees jobs. And that is how Andy and I ended up in the same class together. As a student, Andy was extraordinary. I remember a class on Torah in the first year with Rabbi Mark Solomon, where he gave a presentation that was so above and beyond anything that Rabbi Mark had expected. It wasn't just a presentation, it was a lecture with handouts and flowcharts of underlying themes in the Sidra and more. And it really set the bar for the rest of us. It pushed us for the rest of our time at the Liobet College to excel wherever possible. If Andy didn't get a first in an essay or an exam, there was a really valid reason why not. Many people remember Andy for the soft way he spoke. He was a very gentle soul. He was startlingly innocent, naive, one would say. I remember him once coming back home just before the sun came up one morning, because we would share a house. And I asked Andy what he was doing being out so late. And he told me that he had missed the last train home, so he decided to walk across London at night to get home. Not get a cab, as most people would. Andy literally walked across London. This in and of itself might have been impressive and not problematic, but it was because he was wearing a kippah at the time. Him wearing a kippah, walking across London, he didn't conceive of the possibility that somebody might attack him late at night for being Jewish. And he wore that kippah because he actually saw me do it. And we used to Andy and I would spend hours talking about his own spiritual development. He would ask me why I wore kippah, for example, and after his late night foray through London, I had to explain the times where I wore kippah and the times when I just wore a cap. But he didn't consider the possibility of being attacked that night, because I think he truly believed in the goodness of people. He knew some people had issues, but I think Andy believed that fundamentally the world was a good place. And knowing him helped me believe that sometimes too. Andy had an extraordinary sense of humor. We had a class every week called PC and CS, where we learned pastoral counseling skills. It was Purim, and Andy and I were in a mischievous mood. Every week at PC and CS, we had to share things that were affecting us, and we had to counsel each other while supervised. The teacher for the class wasn't Jewish, so he had no idea that it was Purim. So over lunch, Andy and I came up with a plan to make up the most outrageous things that had happened to us during the week. And I can't remember what mine was, but I realized I was going to laugh and give the game away if I carried it on. So I mentioned it, but I didn't explore it. Andy, however, was in his very cheeky element. Student Rabbi Tony Hammond asked him how he was this week, and Andy explained that he'd been very troubled because that week he said he had gone to an Orthodox synagogue and seen an animal being sacrificed. And it was so profound and so religiously moving for him that he was questioning whether or not he could even remain a Reformed Jew. Of course, the teacher had no idea that this kind of thing didn't go on in an Orthodox synagogue, so he sat quietly and observed as Andy spilled his soul, or seemed to. Andy spoke about how watching the animal bleed to death over the bima was so raw and so real that it was real Judaism, not like our sanitized Reform version. Tony and Andy kept going for 20 minutes without the hint of a smile on their faces. The other two classmates, Student Rabbi Misha Kapustin and I, had to do our very best not to smile. We covered our faces, looking contemplative, but really masking our smiles. It was torture because the two of them were so brilliant together. And finally, after about 20 minutes, Tony asked Andy how he felt about all of this. And Andy said he felt troubled because he had been talking total bull for the last 20 minutes. And that was our cue to roar with laughter, for me to bring out cake, which I had hidden, and for us to explain to the teacher the joke and what Purim was. But that wasn't the only time Andy and Tony held a room together. At a Jewish Christian Muslim conference in Germany, I remember an entire room howling as Andy and Tony reenacted a story in English and German from Andy's life. Moving to England, Andy had decided to bring his Jewish paraphernalia with him. He actually had his own Torah scroll, and it turned out that German custom officials weren't so happy with it because it was made of animal skin. And so they asked for it to be opened up and for him to read from it. But then they came to the shofar. Of course, carrying an animal horn through customs is a big no-no, so Andy sputtered an explanation of how it's actually an instrument. Well, if it's an instrument, said the German customs officer, play it then. But, of course, Andy couldn't. So in the middle of the airport, there he was blowing raspberries into a shofar, trying to convince the customs officer that he wasn't smuggling animal parts, until at the hilarious end of the story, he suddenly got out an entire note, and the entire airport turned to him in shock. I don't know if I've ever seen a room of people roar with laughter so much as when Andy and Tony reenacted that story. It wasn't often that we got to see the performer side of Andy, but certainly his humor came through in continual puns and wordplays in conversation and in class. And before he died, I was actually able to teach him how to be able to blow the shofar continually so he could avoid that situation ever again. I also remember Purim with Andy for another reason, not just because of the PC and CS class. Andy and I went to the fancy dress shop because we were determined to get good costumes for Purim another year. I went with Darth Maul from Star Wars, obviously, and he went with the Star Trek officer's uniform. I came home from services and walked in with a small tape player snuck away so that Darth Maul's theme tune could play as I entered. Andy was already there with other student rabbis talking and drinking. And as they left slowly, Andy and I kept talking and drinking into the long, long hours of the morning. And the next morning, in Rabbi Mark Solomon's class, there was one fewer student. Andy had totally drunk me under the table, and I was way too hungover to even move out of bed. But Andy explained to Rabbi Mark that last night I had fulfilled the mitzvah of Purim, so I was excused. Andy was a keen environmentalist. He helped me work on the Noah Project, which was a London-based Jewish environmental group that we tried in vain to expand across the UK. He was prepared to go all around the UK to set up local Noah Project groups, but in the end, the people in charge of the project wanted to take it in a different direction. In his environmental work, though, Andy raised over €1 million to create an eco-friendly synagogue in Europe. He was deeply committed to the future of the planet. Andy was extremely popular at the Reform Chavurah, which was a monthly gathering of young Jewish adults at the Sternberg Center. Over 100 Jews would attend every month, and we would sing our way through the service and then eat food that a few people had prepared. I will always remember the moment that I announced that he was missing to that group. Andy was so central to the Reform Chavurah that the room was in deep shock. It was 48 hours after I had first called the police to notify them that Andy was missing. I led the community in prayer, asking God to protect Andy if possible, but if not, then to at least be with us. And at the end, I remember reading, Baruch atah Adonai shomea tefillah, blessed are you, eternal God, who listens to our prayers. And then immediately from out of nowhere, the loudest single rumble of thunder that I had until that point ever heard boomed from the heavens. And the entire room froze because at that point it seemed like the universe was acknowledging that Andy going missing was a cosmic event. Andy's murder, perhaps a result of his naivety that I mentioned before, was not just a loss to us in the British community or at the Liobet College, although the trauma there was profound. As a rabbinical student, Andy was in charge of 12 communities back in Germany, whom he would go back and visit as often as he could. He was not only politically astute, but because of his warmth and learning, he would no doubt have been one of the greatest rabbis of this generation. As one of my colleagues wrote about him 5 years ago, Andy would have transformed the rabbinate in Germany, which so desperately needs his integrity, joy, and love of the Jewish people. Not only was he cheated of his life, German Jewry has been cheated of a much-needed independent and scholarly leader and is vastly diminished because of it. Andy was going to work in Hanover after ordination, which was still 3 more years on from when he was killed. People flocked to Andy because he was caring, thoughtful, gentle, and he was a good listener. He was really there for people, helping them explore their passions. He would truly have been a worldwide name for Jewry. But there was another side to him, a side that lots of people didn't know about, but which he shared with me. Andy was profoundly lonely. That, combined with his naivety, is why he ultimately went home with the wrong person that fateful night 20 years ago this week. Andy so profoundly wanted to be loved. Andy knew that he was never going to have children, so he told me that he did everything he could when he taught children, such as those at Belsize Square Synagogue in London, because he saw them as his children in a different way. The last week of Andy's life in July 2002 was a terrible week. He was helping someone with a piece of writing, and that accidentally downloaded a virus onto his computer, thereby wiping many of his files, including the original piece of work, which he then tried to rewrite from memory. I remember him buying software to try to get rid of it, but it spread, and soon all of his devices were infected. He was also helping run summer study week with me at the Liobet College, and he was stressed beyond belief. He had told a friend he would pick her up from Heathrow Airport on Wednesday morning before returning to lead a class at summer study week. But he was so stressed that on Tuesday evening he decided to go into London to not be overwhelmed. So I dropped Andy off at Finchley Central Station. I remember that Walking on the Moon was playing by the Police as he stepped out of the car. And that was the last any of us ever saw him. When he didn't pick up the friend from the airport on Wednesday morning, I immediately knew something was wrong. Andy would never let anybody down. It just wasn't in his nature. So I immediately called the police. I remember that afternoon taking a walking tour through Jewish London with Bill Fishman, which was part of our program for summer study week, and I pretended to listen to Bill, who was famous for these informative tours, but really I spent the hours tormented, fearing the worst. For a few days, we wondered if Andy had had a nervous breakdown, if he just snapped from the stress of that terrible week. By Sunday, though, I knew deep down what had happened, and so did the police. A few days later, through an extraordinary twist of fate, Andy's body was discovered, and that allowed the police to eventually put his killer away for the rest of his life. In my installation address to the Temple Beth Shalom community back in 2014, I said this of Andy. Andy taught me what it was to love someone for who they are, and not despite who they are. He was a mensch and a scholar, and still every day I remember him, and I'm inspired by him to be a better rabbi. But that was just scratching the surface. Most homophobes don't even realize that they are homophobes, but I came to realize through Andy that I was. I'd never really spent time with a gay Jew before. I'd never really heard their particular struggle. I'd never realized how I had inadvertently helped contribute to the oppression of other Jews. I thought that queer studies was just apologetics, bending Torah to suit a particular mindset. I was wrong. And Andy showed me that gently, lovingly. I remember sitting with him, discussing the Bible and homosexuality, and him providing differing explanations of how Leviticus 18 could be read, and me explaining that I had not found them convincing. And then he said, even if Torah does condemn it, so what? It was a question I had never even considered as a student rabbi. So what if Torah, a document from a world totally different to ours, condemned homosexuality? So what? Judaism isn't just about Torah. That was a transformative moment for my Judaism and for my rabbinate. It was the moment that ultimately led me here to Santa Fe. It was the moment that made me aware of all the baggage I'd been carrying as a white British heterosexual cis male student rabbi. So when I stand in front of the Temple Beth Shalom community, in a very real sense, Student Rabbi Andreas Hinz does too. 20 years on this week, the loss to the Jewish community is still very profound. A light was extinguished that should never have gone out. At the memorial service that I led in our home once Andy's murder had been confirmed, I started the service with the story of a lamplighter. Being a lamplighter is the occupation of a Jew, says the story. If we do not see that lamps need to be lit, we need to cross the ocean to find them. But first we have to light the lamp within ourselves by removing our coarseness. Then and only then we can go out into the world and light the lamps of others. Student Rabbi Andreas Hinz, my friend, was a lamplighter. He was a pure soul. He would selflessly go anywhere he was needed to light lamps. He lived for other people. There's a Jewish tradition of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim, the 36 righteous people on whom the world depends. As one dies, another is born, and our society keeps going just because of the righteousness of these 36 people. If there is any truth to the idea of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim, the 36 righteous people, then I know that I was lucky enough to know one of them. This week, on the 20th anniversary of Andy's death, I share some of the memories of this extraordinary human being who touched the lives of so many Jews around the world, so that my community can know that when I teach, Andy teaches, and when I pray, Andy prays. It's important, I believe, for a community to know the chain of teaching of their rabbi. And Andy was one of the most important links in my rabbinate. Zichrono livracha, his memory shall always be for blessing, for inspiration, and for good.